The airport buzzed with the usual noise of rolling suitcases, boarding calls, and people hurrying in every direction, yet one traveler moved through it all without drawing much attention. He looked like someone who had spent far too many hours in transit gray jacket, worn shoes, and a duffel bag that had clearly seen better days. His face carried the kind of calm that comes from long experience, but to anyone watching, he seemed like just another tired passenger trying to get home. He walked slowly. Not because he was weak or unsure, but because he liked to observe things. Every direction he looked, every small pause he took, made it seem as though he was simply adjusting to the crowd. Nobody knew that he was actually paying close attention to the details around him, the way security officers moved, how passengers reacted to announcements, which doors staff used, and how the flow of people changed every few minutes. The traveler had a quiet presence. He didn't push or bump into anyone. He didn't complain when a group rushing toward their gate nearly knocked his bag sideways. He simply stepped aside, nodded politely, and continued on. People noticed him for a second, but forgot him just as fast. To them, he was invisible in a place full of noise. He kept his shoulders relaxed, his steps steady, and his eyes soft. He knew that the more ordinary he looked, the less attention he would attract. And that suited him perfectly. He didn't want attention. He didn't want people staring or asking questions. The last thing he needed was someone trying to guess what kind of work he did or why he traveled so often at one point. He paused near a window where sunlight poured through, warming the floor. He stood there for a moment, breathing in the slightly stale scent of airport air mixed with fresh pretzels from a nearby shop. A few kids played with a toy airplane, spinning it through the air and laughing loudly. The scene made him smile a little. Despite traveling all the time, he still found small moments to appreciate, but behind that calm smile, he was tired. Not just travel tired, but mentally tired. He had spent the past few days moving from meeting to meeting, often with barely enough time to rest. His schedule had been tight, and his work required focus and quick thinking. The airport was the first place in days where he had a few minutes to himself. As he walked toward the security check, he noticed the officers at the front. They looked stressed, moving briskly as they checked passes and managed the line. One officer rubbed his neck repeatedly, clearly exhausted. Another was busy giving directions to travelers who seemed equally confused. The traveler observed all of this with the same calm interest he showed everything else. He wasn't judging them. He simply understood the pressure of their job. The line moved slowly, and he stayed patient. He didn't sigh or tap his foot or check his watch every few seconds. His eyes wandered over the screens displaying gate numbers and delays. A family behind him struggled with a stroller, so he stepped a little to the side to give them more room. The mother thanked him softly. He nodded back. When it was finally his turn to place his belongings into the gray trays, he did so carefully. He placed his duffel bag in one tray, his jacket in another, and a small locked case in a third. The case was sturdy, clean, and clearly important, though he handled it without drawing attention. It was the kind of item people might get curious about, but because he moved so calmly, nobody seemed to care. He pushed the trays forward and waited, standing with his hands loosely at his sides. A few officers glanced at him but quickly looked away. He didn't fit the image of someone they needed to worry about. He didn't look angry, scared, or in a hurry. He looked like a man who was simply doing what everyone else was doing, getting through the airport so he could move on with his day behind him. A couple argued softly about a lost boarding pass. In front of him, an elderly man struggled to take off his shoes, and the traveler reached out instinctively. "Do you need help?" he asked politely. The older man smiled gratefully. "Thank you, son. These laces don't like me very much anymore." The traveler helped him untie the stubborn knots with patience. The act didn't attract any attention from the officers, but a few passengers nearby smiled at the kindness. In a place filled with stress and haste, small gestures stood out. When the older man was ready, the traveler stepped back into his own space, giving the man room to continue through the scanner. Another announcement echoed overhead, this time calling passengers to board at a distant gate. People rushed past him, nearly colliding into one another as though the airport would fall apart if they didn't hurry. He watched them for a moment, mused by the urgency that airports always seem to create. He looked down at the floor briefly, taking another breath. Soon, he told himself, he would be on a plane again. Soon, he would reach his next destination. There was still work to do, still people depending on him, still responsibilities waiting. But for now, he was just a traveler in an airport, and that was exactly how he wanted to appear. He didn't know, of course, that within the next few minutes everything around him would shift, that some officers, tired and stressed, would mistake his calm for something suspicious, that his quiet nature would make them curious in the wrong way, that his ordinary appearance would convince them he was someone they could question without hesitation. For now, all of that remained ahead of him. He simply waited for his tray to pass through the machine, unaware that the smallest misunderstanding would soon change the entire atmosphere around him. He glanced toward the officers again, studying their movements the same way someone might watch a busy street, not with interest, but with quiet awareness. Something about his gaze was steady, focused, and sharper than most people's. But because his posture was relaxed and his expression calm, nobody noticed the depth in his eyes. People rarely noticed him at all. A teenager nearby dropped a water bottle, which rolled near the traveler's foot. He picked it up and handed it back without a word. The boy muttered a quick thanks, already distracted by his phone. The traveler chuckled softly to himself. The conveyor belt hummed as his belongings moved slowly forward. He watched patiently, hands still relaxed by his sides. The locked case caught the light for a moment, and he stepped a bit closer, making sure it stayed upright. It wasn't fragile, but he always handled it carefully. Someone behind him sneezed, and he instinctively stepped forward to give them more space. Everything about the way he moved was gentle, natural. No sudden motions, no signs of tension. If someone had asked the officers to describe him right then, they probably would have said he looked like a teacher, or maybe a quiet office worker who didn't like drawing attention. Someone soft-spoken, someone ordinary, and yet, for a man who seemed so simple, there was something deep and thoughtful in the way he observed the world. His tray reached the end of the machine, and he stepped forward, ready to collect his things. He didn't know that he was about to be stopped, questioned, and judged within seconds. He didn't know that the next few minutes would test his patience in a way he hadn't expected. For now, he just picked up his jacket, shook it lightly, and prepared to place it back over his arm. He didn't rush. He didn't look worried. He had no reason to be. Not yet. The moment that would change everything was only a breath away. But the traveler remained unaware of the tension building around him. He wasn't expecting trouble. He wasn't expecting to be mistaken for something he wasn't. All he wanted was to catch his next flight, sit quietly in his seat, and enjoy a few hours of peace before arriving at his next destination. But life, especially in busy places like airports, rarely followed the plans people made. And in just a moment, the traveler would realize that staying unnoticed wasn't always possible. No matter how quietly he moved, the traveler had just lifted his jacket from the tray when he heard a voice behind him. Sharp enough to cut through the noise of the airport. Double quote, sir. Step aside for a moment. He paused. His hand froze just short of the edge of his duffel bag. The tone wasn't angry, but it carried an authority that didn't invite questions. He turned slowly and saw two officers standing only a step away. Both looked tired, as if they had been dealing with issues since early morning. One officer had creases around his eyes that deepened when he frowned. The other held a scanner in one hand and wore an expression that suggested he had already made up his mind about something. The traveler nodded politely. Even though he didn't understand why he was being stopped, he stepped to the side, giving them room. He didn't feel nervous, only a little surprised. Things like this usually didn't happen, but airports were unpredictable places, and he knew that better than most. The first officer pointed toward his trays. "Is all this yours?" "Yes," the traveler replied calmly. "We need to check your items again," the officer said. "Please stay here," the traveler nodded. He wasn't angry or offended. He understood that officers had a difficult job, and sometimes they needed to double-check things. So he stood quietly, hands relaxed, his eyes soft. But then the second officer leaned closer and asked, "Why were you watching everything around you earlier?" The question caught him off guard. "Watching?" he repeated. "Yes," the officer said. "You were observing everyone, That's unusual behavior. Traveler blinked slowly. He wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't doing anything wrong, just noticing things the way he always did. I was just looking around, he said gently. Nothing more. The officer didn't seem satisfied. His eyes narrowed a little, as if he expected a different answer. The traveler stayed calm. He knew that explaining too much sometimes created more trouble. Simpler was better. One of the officers picked up his duffel bag and began checking it more thoroughly. The traveler watched silently, not wanting to interrupt. He didn't mind them searching. He had nothing to hide. But the tone the officers used felt different. No more pressured, less routine. A few passengers nearby slowed down to see what was happening, but most walked past without paying attention. Airports were filled with distractions. A man being questioned at security wasn't unusual. While the officers opened each zipper, Traveler's eyes drifted toward the small locked case on the table. It hadn't been opened, but he could see one of the officers staring at it with curiosity. "What's in that case?" the officer asked. "Documents," the traveler answered simply. "What kind of documents?" the officer pressed. "Work-related documents." "Open it," the officer said. The traveler paused. His expression remained gentle, but something subtle changed in his eyes. He reached for the case slowly, placing his hand lightly on top of it. "This case contains federal property," he said in a steady voice. "I recommend calling your supervisor before opening it." The officer frowned. "Why?" "Because it's sensitive material," the traveler replied. He wasn't defensive, just matter of fact. The officers exchanged glances. One of them crossed his arms, clearly not convinced. "We can open anything that comes through here," he said. "You're not an exception." "I understand," the traveler said softly. "But you might want to speak with someone with higher authority first." The tone was calm, not threatening, but the officers didn't like it. They seemed to think he was challenging their position. The first officer stepped closer. "Sir, unlock the case." The traveler didn't move. He simply kept his hand resting on the case. His expression stayed calm, but his silence made the officers tense. "Are you refusing to cooperate?" the officer asked. "No," the traveler said quietly. "I'm cooperating. I'm also giving a warning that opening this without proper clearance could cause problems for all of us." The officer's frustration grew. "Sir, you're not the one who decides that." The traveler looked at him with the same gentle eyes, but inside he could feel the situation turning unnecessarily complicated. He didn't want trouble. He didn't want a scene. Yet the officers seemed determined to treat him as if he were hiding something dangerous around them. People continued moving as usual, completely unaware of the tension at the security table. One of the officers reached toward the case. The traveler moved his hand slightly, not to stop him, but to guide the case away by an inch. That small motion made both officers stiffen. "Sir." "Step back," the officer said sharply. The traveler stepped back immediately, raising his hand slightly to show he wasn't resisting. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't angry. If anything, he seemed calmer than the officers, but his calmness only seemed to irritate them more. "Why do you have a locked case?" the second officer demanded. "I travel with work materials often," the traveler explained. "It's normal for me." "Why is it locked?" "To keep the contents safe." "Safe from what?" "From damage." "From unauthorized access." His voice remained soft, the way one might speak to a nervous animal. He wasn't sarcastic. He wasn't playing games. He was simply explaining. But the officers didn't seem to hear the calm. They only heard what they assumed was defiance. The tension grew when one officer tried to tug the case closer. The traveler gently placed his hand on the table, not touching the case anymore, just grounding himself. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," he said quietly. "Then unlock it," the officer snapped. "I will unlock it," the traveler said softly, "but only in the presence of someone who understands what's inside. That's all I'm asking." The officer rolled his eyes. "Call for backup," he told his partner. Backup, that word seemed unnecessary for such a simple situation. But the traveler didn't react. He only stood a little straighter, his eyes lowering for a moment, as if he were trying to gather patience. A few people in line glanced toward him now. They could feel that something was happening, but they didn't know what. The traveler didn't look dangerous. He didn't look troubled. If anything, he looked like someone who wanted the situation to be resolved quietly. The officer who had been checking his duffel bag finally finished and closed it, then placed it back on the table as if expecting to open it again later. The traveler gave a small nod of thanks, though the officer didn't acknowledge it. Minutes passed. Not many, but long enough for the traveler to feel the weight of the officer's suspicion settle around him like a heavy coat. A new officer arrived, taller, older, clearly someone with more authority. He approached with a firm walk, eyes sharp and already frustrated, though he hadn't even heard what happened yet. "What's going on here?" he asked. The first officer immediately began explaining, his tone slightly exaggerated, as if trying to justify why they were taking the situation so seriously. He mentioned the traveler's strange behavior, the refusal to open the case, and the unusual awareness he showed while in line. The traveler stayed quiet as the officer spoke. He didn't interrupt, didn't defend himself. He simply waited, hands loose by his sides. When the supervisor turned to him, the traveler met his gaze calmly. "Sir," the supervisor said, "is there a reason you won't open this case?" "Yes," the traveler replied. "Because it contains federal property? It requires proper clearance before being opened." The supervisor blinked. "Federal?" "Yes. Do you have identification that proves that?" "I do. Where is it?" "In the case?" Supervisor sighed in irritation. "Why would you put your identification inside a case you won't open?" "It is inside because it is part of the material protected by federal guidelines," the traveler explained softly. "But if you want me to show my credentials, I will open it for you." "Only you." The officers around them glanced at each other. The supervisor stared at the traveler for a long moment, trying to decide whether he was telling the truth or playing a game. Finally, the supervisor nodded. "Open it, let me see." The traveler reached slowly for the case. Not rushed, not dramatic, just steady movements that came from habit. His fingertips rested on the lock. The officers leaned in slightly, curiosity pushing past their suspicion. The traveler lifted the lock. The case clicked. The moment was small, almost silent. But it carried a weight none of them expected. What came next would change the entire attitude of the officers within seconds, but for now, the traveler simply opened the lid, gently and carefully, making sure it rested fully before stepping back. He lifted his eyes. The supervisor leaned forward, and everything in the air shifted. The lid of the case opened slowly, almost too gently for the tension that had built around the table. The traveler didn't make a sound as he lifted it. He simply stepped back half a pace, giving the supervisor room to see inside. The officers nearby leaned forward without meaning to, their eyes narrowing with curiosity. Inside the case were neatly arranged documents, sealed envelopes, and a single badge placed in a protective frame. The badge had a polished shine, the kind that suggested it belonged to someone who carried a serious responsibility. But the officers didn't see the badge right away. Their attention went first to the envelopes marked with bold, official stamps. The supervisor froze for a moment, his eyes widening just a fraction. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to make the traveler notice. "What is this?" the supervisor asked, his voice quieter now. "Federal credentials," the traveler answered simply. "They verify my position and authorize the materials I carry." The supervisor didn't respond. He leaned in slightly to read the labels on the envelopes. His expression changed slowly, like someone trying to solve a puzzle and realizing pieces fit in a way he never expected. The officers who had been suspicious earlier now looked uncertain. Their shoulders straightened unconsciously, as if their bodies understood the situation before their minds did. The supervisor pointed to the badge. "Is this what I think it is?" "Yes," the traveler replied. "It identifies me as an inspector assigned to evaluate security operations." The words hung in the air. The officers looked at one another. None of them spoke. None of them moved. For a moment, the entire security area seemed quieter. Even though people continued rushing past as usual, the traveler didn't look proud or smug. His expression stayed the same, calm, patient, almost gentle. He wasn't the type to use his authority to embarrass anyone. He had opened the case because he needed to, not because he wanted to prove a point. The supervisor slowly cleared his throat and stepped back. "Why didn't you say this earlier?" he asked. "You didn't ask," the traveler said softly. It wasn't said with attitude. It was just the truth. The supervisor nodded slowly. He seemed unsure whether to apologize or continue the questioning. His eyes shifted to the two officers who had stopped the traveler earlier. Their expressions had changed completely. The confidence they had shown before was gone. Now they looked nervous, as if they realized the situation had gone far beyond what they expected. "Sir," the supervisor said carefully, "we may have misunderstood you." The traveler gave a small nod. "I understand. You have a difficult job. Mistakes happen." The simplicity of his words made the officers look even more uncomfortable. They weren't used to being treated calmly by someone they had questioned so aggressively. One of the officers glanced at the badge again and quickly looked away. Another officer stepped back slightly, standing straighter, as if unsure whether he should apologize or remain silent. The supervisor finally let out a slow breath. "I need to notify my higher-ups," he said quietly. "Please wait here." The traveler nodded again. He didn't complain or ask how long it would take. He simply stood with his hands clasped in front of him, waiting with the same patience he had shown since the beginning. The supervisor stepped aside and spoke into his radio, his voice low and steady. The officers around him listened without speaking. The travelers in line watched from a distance, sensing something important, but not understanding what it was. Meanwhile, the traveler remained still. He looked at the floor for a moment, then at the people passing by. Some walked with the usual rush, others with sleepy eyes, and a few with excitement for their journeys. He watched them the same way he had watched everything else, quietly, thoughtfully. He didn't blame the officers. He didn't think they were bad people. Airports made everyone tense. When people felt pressure, they sometimes misjudged others. He had seen it many times before. After a few minutes, the supervisor returned. His face looked more serious but not angry. If anything, he seemed embarrassed. "Sir," he began, "our department has confirmed your identity." The officers stiffened at the words. The traveler gave another soft nod. "Not surprised?" the supervisor continued. "We are instructed to cooperate with you in any way necessary. I want to apologize for how the situation was handled." The traveler met his eyes. "There's no need for apologies. You were doing your job. That's what matters." His calm tone made the officers look down slightly, not out of shame, but out of relief. But the supervisor hesitated, as if he felt the apology should be said anyway. "We still shouldn't have made assumptions," the supervisor said quietly. The traveler didn't respond right away. He looked at the officers who had questioned him, noticing the tension in their shoulders. "It's all right," he said gently. "Just remember that not everyone who looks ordinary is ordinary. Sometimes people carry responsibilities you can't see." The officers nodded, unable to say anything in return. The traveler closed the case carefully and locked it again. His movements were slow and respectful, as if the documents inside deserved quiet handling. When he lifted the case, he held it close, then placed his jacket over his arm. The supervisor motioned for him to move ahead. "You're free to go. If you need anything, I'll manage," the traveler said with a polite smile. But before he left, he paused. He looked at the officers again, with anger, not with superiority, but with something almost kind. "You do important work," he said. "Just make sure everyone feels respected. It makes your job easier, and it makes their day smoother." The officers nodded again, this time with more understanding. They didn't argue or explain themselves. They simply listened. The traveler stepped away from the table. His steps were steady, slow, and calm, just as they had been when he first walked into the airport. But the air around him had changed. The officers watched him leave, their expressions quiet and thoughtful. He moved through the terminal without rushing. The noise of the airport returned, filling the space around him. People walked past, unaware of what had happened at the security checkpoint. To them, he was just another traveler. But the officers who had spoken with him knew differently as he walked farther into the terminal. He found a small seat near a window. He sat down, placing the case safely beside him. He leaned back, breathing slowly. A bit of tiredness settled into his eyes, not from anger, but from the weight of responsibility he carried. In the reflection of the window, he saw the movement of people behind him. The officers were still at their station, working as usual. Their expressions were more careful now, more thoughtful. They seemed to look at each traveler differently. The traveler didn't smile, but there was a peace in his expression. Not the peace of victory, but the peace of knowing things were settled. A plane outside rolled toward the runway. He watched it lift into the sky, disappearing into a thick layer of clouds. His own journey would begin soon. He took a slow breath, letting the noise of the airport fade into the background. He didn't think about what had happened. He had dealt with situations like that many times, always with the same calmness. It wasn't his job to correct people. It was his job to observe, to understand, and to move forward. As the minutes passed, he refocused on his travel plans. He checked the time on the large digital clock nearby. His flight was still scheduled. No delays. He reached into his pocket for a small notebook, flipped it open, and wrote a few lines. Not about the officers, not about the misunderstanding, but about the people he had seen, the patterns he had noticed, the details that might matter later. It was his way of staying sharp. More passengers filled the seating area around him. A woman whispered into her phone, a man typed loudly on his laptop, and a child tugged playfully at his parent's sleeve. Life continued as usual, and the traveler sat quietly among them. Ordinary on the outside, something deeper on the inside. He didn't need people to know who he was. He didn't need recognition. His work wasn't done for praise, it was done because it mattered. He closed his notebook, slipped it back into his pocket, and leaned back again. In a little while, he would board the plane. In a little while, he would continue toward his next responsibility. But for now, he simply rested, letting the moment be peaceful again. He hoped the officers behind him would remember what happened not because of the badge he carried, but because of the lesson it reminded them of. Respect. It wasn't difficult, but it made all the difference. The officers stood in a tense line near the security door. But the air in the terminal felt strangely quiet now. People who had been watching from afar kept their distance, yet they didn't walk away either. Something about the way the traveler carried himself made them feel like the story wasn't finished. Even the workers behind the counters stopped pretending to type on their screens. They were waiting, listening, wondering what would happen next. The traveler didn't rush. He never moved with unnecessary speed. He simply breathed, kept his posture calm, and watched the officers who had suddenly lost their confidence. A few seconds ago, they were convinced they were dealing with someone ordinary. Now every single one of them looked unsure of what they were supposed to do next. The officer who seemed to be in charge stood stiffly, like he didn't know whether he should keep the traveler here or step aside. He opened his mouth twice as if he wanted to speak, but stopped each time. His hands hung near his belt, not because he planned to use anything, but because he didn't know where else to put them. He looked around, hoping someone would tell him what to do, but no one did. The traveler looked at the officer and said quietly, "I asked a simple question. Why am I being stopped?" His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Something about it made people nearby straighten a little, as if the tone itself demanded attention. The officer swallowed hard. "Sir, we were following a report." "What report?" the traveler asked. The officer hesitated again. You could see the conflict in his face. He didn't want to admit he had acted on something that wasn't exactly solid. But he also didn't want to lie to someone whose badge clearly meant something. "There was a call," the officer finally said. "Someone thought you looked suspicious." "We were told to keep an eye out." "A call from who?" the traveler asked. "We don't know," the officer answered. "It came through our duty line." The traveler didn't react, at least not visibly. But the silence that followed told everyone he was thinking deeper than anyone in that room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make any sudden moves. He simply stood there. And somehow that was enough to make the officer shift uncomfortably. So just to be clear, the traveler said softly, you stopped me without reason, searched me without cause, and refused to answer questions until I showed you who I am. The officer drew in a slow breath. Sir. It wasn't meant to be disrespectful. The traveler gave a small nod, though the meaning behind it wasn't clear. He wasn't agreeing, and he wasn't forgiving. It was more like he was acknowledging that he heard the words, not that he accepted them. People were still watching. A family sitting nearby pretended not to stare, but every one of them had their eyes pointed toward the scene. A man who had been standing in the boarding line stepped out of it completely, trying to get a better view. Even the airport announcement system seemed to pause between messages, as if waiting for the traveler to say something. The traveler took one slow step forward. The officer stepped back at the same time. It wasn't intentional. Their bodies just reacted to the authority. They had suddenly realized they were facing. The officer in charge lifted his hand slightly. Sir, please wait. For what? The traveler asked. For my supervisor, the officer replied. The traveler looked around the room and then back at him. Your supervisor should already be here. You detained me. Standard procedure is for the ranking officer to report. The officer's face turned pale. He hadn't expected the traveler to know that. Even some of his own team didn't know the exact rule. But the traveler knew. He knew every detail. Do you want us to call him again? The officer asked quietly. The traveler nodded once. The officer quickly signaled to another member of his team. The younger officer fumbled with his radio, almost dropping it before pressing the button. His voice cracked slightly as he asked for the supervisor to come to the east security gate. While they waited, the traveler looked around the terminal. His eyes moved slowly, taking in the people nearby, the workers behind the counter, the signs posted on the walls, even the cameras overhead. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't angry either, but something about him felt heavy, like he carried more responsibility than anyone in the room could understand. A woman standing by a suitcase whispered to her partner, "Do you think he is?" Her partner shook his head. Someone important. Look at the officers. The traveler didn't comment. He didn't acknowledge the whispers. He kept his focus on the officers, waiting. A few minutes later, the supervisor arrived. He looked different from the others, older, more experienced, more aware that certain mistakes could cost more than a formal complaint. The moment he saw the traveler, he slowed his pace, his expression tightening. He didn't need an explanation. The badge had already been shown earlier, and its significance was clear. The supervisor stepped closer and placed a hand on his belt knot in a threatening way, but in a respectful, cautious manner. "Sir," he said carefully, "I was informed of the situation. I apologize for any misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" the traveler repeated calmly. The supervisor took a breath. "Yes, sir. My officers acted on an anonymous report. It wasn't handled as well as it should have been." The traveler didn't look at the supervisor's eyes right away. Instead, he kept his gaze on the floor for a moment, as if he was weighing his thoughts before letting them out. "I know how these things start," the traveler said. "Someone sees a person who doesn't fit their idea of normal and decides to create a situation. And instead of checking the facts, your officers acted immediately." The supervisor's jaw tightened slightly. "You're right, sir. They should have verified the report before confronting you." A long silence settled between them. The officers behind the supervisor shifted nervously, waiting for the traveler to say something that would decide whether this incident would be just a warning or something far more serious. The traveler finally looked at the supervisor. His expression wasn't angry, but it held a weight that made everyone around pay attention. "What bothers me," the traveler said, "is how quickly assumptions turn into actions. How easily someone can be labeled suspicious without any reason. And how simple it is for a person's dignity to be challenged because someone else felt uncomfortable." The supervisor nodded quietly. "You're absolutely right, sir." The traveler didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calm tone forced every word to sink into the space around them. "Your team needs better training," he said. "Not just in procedures, but in how they treat people." The supervisor nodded again, slower this time. "I agree. This will be addressed fully." Another silence passed. But this time, it wasn't tense. It was thoughtful. Even the onlookers sensed the shift. The traveler had taken control of the moment without force, without anger, without threat. He used only truth, steadiness, and presence. The supervisor finally said, "Sir, if there's anything we can do to make this right, tell me." The traveler looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Just let me continue my journey," he said quietly. "That's all I wanted from the beginning." The supervisor exhaled, relieved. He nodded firmly and motioned for the officers to stand down. They immediately stepped aside, clearing a path. People around the terminal relaxed. A few even let out breaths they didn't realize they had been holding. The traveler adjusted the strap of his bag and walked forward slowly, passing the officers with the same calm he had carried from the start. But even as he moved toward his gate, the story didn't feel over. Something deeper was happening, something none of the officers understood yet, because the traveler wasn't angry. But he wasn't done either. There was still a reason for the anonymous report, and he intended to find out who made it. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The officers watched him with a mix of respect and unease. Realizing they had just faced someone whose role reached far beyond anything they had, imagine as he continued down the terminal. The whispers returned, but now they carried a different tone. Not fear, not suspicion, respect, and curiosity. The traveler knew the next step of his journey wasn't just about catching a flight. It was about uncovering the truth behind the call that started everything, and he was ready. The traveler walked through the terminal with steady steps, but inside, his thoughts were moving faster than his feet. The incident hadn't shaken him, but it had stirred something. A quiet resolve sat in his chest, like a weight he carried without complaint. He knew the officers had made a mistake, but mistakes weren't the problem. Mistakes could be corrected. What mattered was finding the reason someone had tried to create trouble for him. As he moved past a row of shops, he slowed down. The airport felt louder now, full of announcements and rolling luggage. Yet beneath the noise, he sensed something else, a pattern, a rhythm, a small detail that didn't fit. He paused and looked over his shoulder. Nothing obvious stood out, but his instincts tugged at him. He wasn't paranoid. He had spent years training to notice what others ignored. A shift in movement, a repeated glance, a person staying in the same place too long. Small things that usually meant nothing to others, but meant everything to him. He continued walking, but took a different path toward his gate. He wanted to see if the feeling followed. It did. A quiet signal passed through him, one he had learned to trust long ago. He didn't turn his head. He didn't look behind him. He simply let the moment stretch. Observing the reflections in the glass of the shops he passed, someone was there. Not close enough to be obvious, not far enough to be irrelevant. A man in plain clothes, pretending to check his phone, but his eyes lifted too often. He didn't walk like a traveler. He didn't look at the departure boards. He wasn't holding a ticket. He was watching. The traveler kept his pace calm. He didn't want to cause a scene. He wanted clarity. He reached the gate area, but instead of sitting, he stepped aside near the large window. The man who had been following him paused at a distance, pretending to read a sign. The traveler watched his reflection in the glass. He could feel the intention behind the man's steps, not hostile, but not harmless either. This wasn't someone who called security out of fear. This was someone who wanted to confirm something. The traveler took out his phone and gently tilted it, using the screen's reflection to see behind him. The man's eyes were fixed in his direction, so it wasn't random. The traveler breathed slowly. He wasn't angry, he was curious. Why him? Why today? Why now? He remembered the anonymous report. A stranger calling in, saying someone looked suspicious. It had been too convenient, too specific, and too timely. Whoever was watching him now knew exactly what they were doing. The traveler turned and walked toward a quieter corner near the emergency exit, not to hide, but to create a space where intentions could be revealed without involving everyone nearby. Sure enough, the man followed. When the traveler finally stopped walking, he didn't face the man directly. He stood beside a wall and looked down at his phone as if he were reading a message. The man approached. Slowly, then he spoke. "Sir," the man said softly, "I need a moment." The traveler didn't look up. "Who are you?" "A friend," the man said quickly. "That usually means the opposite," the traveler replied. The man hesitated. "Not this time." Traveler finally looked at him. "You made the call?" "Indirectly," the man admitted. "I needed the officers to stop you so I could confirm something." The traveler's face didn't change, but something in his posture grew sharper. "You used them as a distraction." The man nodded. "Yes." "Why?" the traveler asked. The man glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "Because I needed to be sure it was you." "Why?" the traveler repeated. The man exhaled. "Because you're being followed. Not by me. By others. People who shouldn't be anywhere near this airport." The traveler watched him carefully, searching for any sign of deceit. "How do you know?" "Because I used to work with them," the man said quietly. "And when someone like you steps into a place like this, they pay attention." "What do they want?" the traveler asked. The man swallowed. "Information." The traveler almost smiled, not in amusement, but in recognition. "I don't carry information, not the kind you hold," the man said. "The kind you are." A long silence passed. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from confusion. It was the kind that came when truths began arranging themselves. The traveler asked, "Who told you to find me?" "No one," the man said. "I left them months ago. But when I saw two of them at the entrance, scanning faces, I knew something was happening. I didn't want them to reach you first." "Why help me?" the traveler asked. The man lowered his voice. "Because I know who you are. And I know what you do. I know the work you've done for this country. You don't deserve to be hunted." The traveler didn't respond immediately. He looked out at the runway through the large windows, watching the planes moving in slow patterns. Then he said, "Where are they now?" "Somewhere in this terminal," the man answered, "probably waiting for a signal." The traveler nodded, not out of fear, but out of understanding. "We thought the officers would slow me down long enough for you to reach me?" "Yes," the man said. "I couldn't approach you directly, not with them around. They would have mistaken me for someone I used to be." The traveler studied him for a moment. "What do you want from me now?" "To warn you," the man said, "and to ask for one chance." "One chance for what?" "To fix what I broke," the man said quietly. The traveler didn't move, but his eyes softened, not in a gentle way, but in a thoughtful one. "You think warning me is enough to repair your past?" the traveler asked. "No," the man said, "but it's a start." The traveler let the silence stretch again. He wasn't trying to intimidate the man, he was measuring his sincerity. After a moment, the traveler said, "If they're looking for me, they will find me." "That's exactly why I came," the man said. "You need to leave this airport." The traveler raised an eyebrow. "And go where?" "The service entrance," the man said. "There's a way out that avoids the main terminals. You can get a direct transfer to a private security lane. They won't dare follow you there." The traveler didn't answer right away. He studied the man's face, reading every shift and flicker. Finally, he said, "Take me." The man nodded quickly and began leading the way toward an unmarked hallway near the maintenance area. The traveler followed, moving with calm but heightened awareness. As they walked, the traveler spoke. "You said you used to work with them. What changed?" The man paused for a moment before answering. "I realized the people we were watching weren't the threats we were told they were. The real threats were the people giving the orders." The traveler didn't comment, but he understood. They reached a metal door with a small keypad. The man pressed a code, and the lock clicked open. He held the door for the traveler, who walked inside. The hallway behind the door was quiet, empty, dimly lit. It didn't look like part of the airport at all, more like the skeleton of the building as they moved deeper inside. The man said, "I'm taking you to someone who can help." "Who?" the traveler asked. The man hesitated. "Someone you used to work with." The traveler felt a small flicker of tension, but he stayed calm. "Who is waiting for me?" "You'll see," the man said. They reached another door. The man knocked twice. A moment later, the door opened. Standing on the other side was a woman in a dark uniform, steady, composed, and unmistakably high dash ranking. The traveler's eyes narrowed slightly in recognition. She looked at him with relief. "We've been trying to reach you," she said. "You're not safe here." The traveler stepped inside and closed the door behind him. In that small room, the truth finally settled. The anonymous call. The followers. The watching eyes. The tension in the terminal. None of it had been an accident. He hadn't just been another traveler, and now finally knew why. The story that began with a simple misunderstanding was never simple at all. It had been the beginning of something bigger, something that would shape the next step of his journey. He breathed out slowly. He was ready.